On TVS, Dr. John Bowlby asks, are mothers really necessary?
Maternal love is just as important in childhood as vitamins. And without vitamins, you don't get physical health, and without maternal love, you don't get mental health.
The distinguished child psychiatrist, John Bowlby, has been studying Homo sapiens for over 50 years. Bowlby believes that future happiness for individuals and for society as a whole depends on the relationship between mother and child when they are making the bonds. According to Bowlby, for the first 5 years at least, a child should be cared for consistently by one loving adult, and nature has decreed that the role of caregiver should fall to woman.
The way it works is that on one hand, you had feminists who thought that the emphasis on motherhood was a part of a sexual cell, and that if women were to be free, they were going to have to jettison the whole domestic package. And then on the other side, there were women who felt that motherhood itself had been degraded and devalued as the house became marginal to social life and political life, and that what we needed to do was to reconstruct domestic relationships. They have always been two sides of the same coin, really. One side leads to the corporate feminist who gets a seat on the board and becomes the president's advisor on women's affairs, and the other side leads to women trying to invent new ways of living.
One school of feminism really has it that girls ought to have a career just like men. And any getting married, having a husband, having children and so on is so second-rate and unimportant that you just either don't do it at all or don't bother about it. No, I think that's very silly.
A mother who is weeding the fields in Ethiopia is working. It's never considered then that it's inimical to her status as mother. Mind you, it is important, I think, that women are not separated from their infants when they're carryable, and they should do work, in my view, which is compatible with still being with their children. I think they'd want to.
John Bowlby may be surprised to discover some lukewarm support in the feminist camp. At the age of 80, Bowlby is used to controversy. His critics have called his work male chauvinist, right-wing, and just plain wrong. But Bowlby adamantly refuses to be distracted from his professional concern, the mental health of the nation.
10% of the people in this country spend part of their life in a mental hospital before they die. 10%, 1 in 10. Another 20% have major psychiatric problems. They may get by reasonably well and they don't get into a mental hospital, but they are, to a greater or less degree, crippled.
John Bowlby believes that he has identified a major cause of mental instability, a basic human need which is seriously misunderstood by our modern society. He offers his conclusions not as a matter of opinion, but as scientifically established truth.
I'm the girl that makes the thing that drills the hole, that holds the string, that drives the rod, that turns the knob, that works the thingamy-bob.
The Second World War accelerated fundamental changes in a society that was already changing. Women were recruited into the workforce in large numbers, and they were there to stay. It was a time of separations. Women from their husbands, children from their fathers, some never to return. The traditional family structure was forced to adapt to altered circumstances, and the processes of change were set to continue into the prosperity of peacetime. Even before the war, John Bowlby had been professionally interested in the psychological effects of separations. He discovered during psychiatric research that many delinquent children shared a common experience in early childhood. A long and enforced separation from their mothers. After the war, Bowlby and his colleagues at the Tavistock Institute in London began a systematic study of separation.
My colleague, James Robertson, was studying what happens to a child when he finds himself in a strange place with strange people. And he's very distressed, and he cries for much longer than people like to believe. And he's very depressed and miserable for much longer than people like to believe. And the curious thing is that when he returns home, not infrequently, he fails to link up with his mother. It appears he doesn't even recognize her. He treats her as a stranger. And this is very wounding to a mother, of course.
James Robertson and his wife, Joyce, produced a series of powerful documentary studies. It was clear that in badly organized separations, children suffered acutely in the short term. But was it possible that these childhood experiences could have long-lasting effects in later life? John Bowlby looked to the animal kingdom for clues and sought the advice of the eminent ethologist, Robert Hind.
John Bowlby was formulating his ideas in the 1950s, and he was coming to the view that a period of separation between mother and child could have long-term effects on the child's development. He had only retrospective data to go on, and it wasn't easy to get other people to accept these ideas. So we thought that if we could produce some experimental data to show that separation had long-term effects, then that would be a great help. And that's why we set up this colony, not with this monkey house, but with an earlier monkey house, deliberately to separate young monkeys from their mothers for a short period to see whether these had long-term deleterious effects. Now, they did have long-term deleterious effects. And they're not experiments that I would want to repeat now because I think they cause quite a lot of suffering to the young monkeys. But at the time, we felt it was justifiable to do these experiments, and we did, in total, about a dozen separations. And these were sufficient to show that under certain conditions of separation, you could pick up the effects of a 6-day separation experience 2 years later.
Well, if the disruption of a bond is so important and has these adverse consequences, what is the nature of the bond that is disrupted? And at that time, the only theory which was about, both in psychological circles and psychoanalytic circles, is children become interested in mothers because they feed them.
An American psychologist, Harry Harlow, had also been experimenting with young monkeys separated from their mothers. Harlow supplied artificial substitute mothers, a wire structure, and a more comforting toweling model.
Harlow, very imaginatively, decided, well, this is an opportunity to study maternal deprivation in rhesus monkeys. And, of course, he found that these little monkeys much preferred the soft dummy to a wire contraption from which they got their food. So he demonstrated that, in monkeys anyway, clinging to a nice, soft, cuddly object is preferred to one that gives food. So that confirmed, you see, that food was really not the center of the stage anymore. He demonstrated that these monkeys that had been brought up without mothers were appallingly bad mothers. They ill-treated their infants. Admittedly, as time went on, the second, third, and fourth infants, you might say, educated them to be better mothers. But they were never awfully good.
Bowlby was also drawn to the work of another psychologist, Konrad Lorenz.
The gist of Lorenz's work was simply this. The young of geese, they are born so that within 24 hours they are capable of running around. Lorenz has done various experiments where, instead of Mother Goose, he was the familiar figure and they followed him. But the point is that a preference develops for keeping proximity to some figure that is familiar. Familiarity is a key point.
If the human infant, like the goslings, quickly learns to rely on a familiar figure, it would not be surprising if the child showed distress when the familiar figure was absent. Mary Ainsworth was a distinguished collaborator of Bowlby. She devised experiments to study the behavior of small children when left by their mothers in complete safety for short periods. The strange situation experiments have been repeated at the University of Minnesota in the United States.
When Mother departs again, episode 6, this time leaving Eva alone, the stress is greatly increased. Eva is clearly upset. Eva's mother can see her on closed-circuit TV from the adjoining room. If either she or the researchers feel that Eva will not settle herself, this period will be cut short, as was done in this case. Instead of the expected mother, the stranger returns in episode 7. Eva's disappointment is obvious. She does not seek to be picked up, and while she accepts contact with the stranger, the contact is not fully effective.
Armed with psychoanalytic case histories, detailed observations of young children in separations, and extensive animal studies, John Bowlby felt able to advance a theory of attachment.
I define attachment in terms of keeping proximity to or accessibility to a preferred figure. And that becomes very evident from about 7 or 8 months. It's synchronized really with the child becoming mobile. The more he can crawl around and run away, the more important it is that there should be a system within himself which keeps him in proximity.
Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution have had a great influence on Bowlby's thinking.
Certainly in days gone by when human beings were living as hunters and gatherers, if any individual was isolated, they were a prey to the local predators, wolves or leopards or whatever they were. So keeping proximity is a good insurance policy. That's the key point. And of course, a small child, if he gets lost, he can die of exposure very easily. I mean, he dies of exposure long before he dies of starvation. So attachment behavior is an indispensable part of an animal's behavior, an animal's equipment.
Sigmund Freud played an important role in Bowlby's intellectual development, but attachment theory leads to an estrangement with the Freudian view of humanity.
Okay, you've got sex, you've got food, you've got attachment, and how do these compare? Well, the answer is attachment's more important, because there's plenty of time to engage in sexual activity. There's plenty of time to feed, because, you know, if you go without food for 2 or 3 days, it won't kill you. But if you are isolated, you can die of exposure, and in many circumstances, a small child can meet with an accident or road accident or something. So, in many ways, attachment behaviors, it takes priority. I'm always talking about that person who cares for a child. I'm not talking about the natural mother. I'm talking about the person who cares for the child. Now, a huge majority of children, of course, are cared for by their own mothers. I think there's no doubt that children come to prefer that figure. But there are also, in the ordinary happy family, subsidiary figures. There's father, who may be an important extra. Grandmother, maybe a nice lady who comes in to look after the child for part of the day. So all these assistants are, I think, enormously important, but they are not the top. It's a hierarchy with preferences.
Well, now, in one sense, I think everybody should be looking after the infants. They should be a common cause of concern. It should be possible for a child to walk to from one end to another of our cities and be helped on its way by people in the street, instead of the situation we have, which is that we've got to watch our children all the time because something will happen to them. I think that when it comes to the actual skin contact, the physical contact, the breast is the obvious indication of the way that should go. It should be a non-invasive contact, non-exploitative contact, and I think it's probably best left to women.
The attachment between mother and child is absolutely central to human happiness. Damage the attachment, damage the child. Mothers carry a heavy burden of responsibility in Bowlby's world. This is too simple a view for some critics.
I find there's something that's always struck me as very odd, that Bowlby comes from a background of psychoanalysis, which one might feel is a tradition where the sort of variety of human behavior, of the complexity of human thought and feeling is something that's emphasized. However, I think in attachment theory you get a very simple view of both children and of parents. The social world is really not present in that theory. I mean, you don't get the idea that daily life is a very complicated matter, that mothers have a whole lot of concerns beyond looking after children. They live in a social world that is not only concerned with children, that they live in a culture, that things vary from culture to culture.
At the Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, Martin Richards is studying the relationships between tiny premature babies and their parents.
Yep.
Oh, he's got his eyes open.
And we know from a lot of work that people have done in the immediate days and weeks after birth that these are very important times often in the building of a relationship. But it's not simply the direct relationship between mother and baby that matters. There are a whole number of things about this situation, about what a mother feels like, for example, having given birth to a very small, very sick baby.
Hello, Jamie.
Her feelings have to be dealt with and are part of the situation. It's the social situation of this unit and units like it, the difficulties of visiting. All these things come into the formation of the relationship, and these really are not there at all in attachment theory.
He hasn't been weighed today, hasn't he?
No, he hasn't been weighed. Well, when I gave birth, I was separated from half an hour later. He was gone, you know, and then he went home the street. I felt really depressed, you know, very, very low, because I had all the presents and the cards, but no baby, you know, and everybody else, they'd come walking in here to their babies or have the babies by the bed. So it was really, really hard, you know, very hard.
For Martin Richards, the bonds between mother and child are more subtle and complex than Bowlby's attachment. The relationship begins earlier, and it involves two-way communication, with the baby just as active as the mother.
Okay, Sally, I'll just adjust the camera, make sure I've got you both in here, all right? That's fine. And,
Dr. Lynn Murray is observing Sally and her 8-week-old baby, Emma.
Never sat in a chair like this before, have you? No. No. Oh, do you like it?
In a moment,
This chair.
Sally will be
That's
asked to
nice.
freeze, to withdraw from the communication.
Yes.
the response that you saw to the blank face situation too, when Sally froze. First of all, Emma sneered and frowned and looked away. Well, if I hadn't told Sally to keep a still face, probably she would have responded to those signs and become drawn back in to the communication. So I think one thing we can say is that very early on, the communication between mother and baby is very rich and well organised, and that the baby is just as active a partner in the interaction as the mother.
Yes.
For centuries, long separations have been a way of life in the Royal Navy. In a naval hospital at Portsmouth, one of the doctors noticed a possible connection between some of his young patients' ailments and their father's duties at sea. He approached Martin Richards, and Cambridge University is now investigating.
I think the point about situations like the periodic absence of men in the Navy, or indeed in many other occupations, the point it really makes is that we don't think that much about fathers. We take it for granted that it's reasonable to expect men who are married, who have children, to work under some regime whereby they may be going away for many months at a time. And I think in that way it shows something of what we feel about fathers as a society and the way we place them as against mothers in family life.
She was uncontrollable. She didn't know where he was. She didn't want me at all. She wanted her dad, and that was it. We had to give her some medicine to calm her down because she was just getting uncontrollable. She's starting to settle down now, and he's been home 3 years, and sometimes she'll give him a kiss, sometimes she won't. But if he's not there for a day, then she'll start asking again, and it takes her about a week to get over that day. Because he was there for her in the first part of her life, and she relied on him, and because he deserted her. But whereas different in the youngest one, he wasn't there, so she didn't know who the daddy was.
One can certainly see that there might be changes in society which would make it, as it did I think in the post-war years, people would have that rather cosy domestic notion of mother and child at home as a very attractive one. And if that happened, I can see that attachment ideas would become perhaps more influential again. But hopefully we are moving to a view where you see parents and children within a context, within a society. And as long as that's kept going, it seems to me that people will want to modify Bowlby's work. They'll want to generalise or to look more broadly at the social world and not stick rather narrowly to this one relationship.
To be a mother is to have no claim on anyone. You've got no claim on your children's loyalty. You've got no claim on the state, not really. I mean, you have a piffling allowance. But on the other hand, your name will be invoked whenever there's a difficulty. One of the most important stages in treating any problem that arises appears to be recognizing your hostility to your mother. And when you do that, you're supposed to be well on the road to recovery. And I've seen cases where I've thought it was really inserted in the case diagnosis, this idea that the mother was the cause of the problem. Once you've succeeded in blaming mother, you're going to get better. I regard this as pernicious myself.
It's not my idea. I mean, I didn't invent attachment, but I think it's a part of the nature of man, and we are wise. We are wise, I think, to live our lives according to our natures rather than to fight them. So, I mean, you might say I'm a nice, ready target for people who don't like human nature.
If nature designed human beings to rear their young, as Bowlby says, then most of Western society is at odds with nature. While their mothers are at work in the city, these youngsters are in the care of fully trained professionals at the Kingsway Children's Centre in London.
I think people should be given a choice into how they run their lives. I think, unfortunately, people don't have a choice nowadays. Often most people have to work. And so if they're put into that financial position, or they're told to get on their bike, get to another part of the country, support themselves, then I think they should be given the resources to look after their families in whichever way they think is appropriate.
I think there is good evidence that with good nursery care and a home environment, children grow up perfectly well, and in fact may well have advantages through the social relationships they can form in the nursery. Similarly for the lives of women. I don't think women should spend their adult lives only involved in childcare. I think it's bad for them and in fact bad for children.
The ill effects on children are not intended. They're what I call a fallout. They're a social fallout of economic success. And we have to consider, well, is the price we're paying too much?
In the remaining programs in this series, we will be looking at British and American society to see if there is evidence to support John Bowlby's theory. If your child goes into hospital, could he emerge a psychological cripple? Are the delinquents and child prostitutes of New York the direct consequence of bad mothering and the breakdown of family life? When we punish delinquent mothers by jailing them, should we jail their children as well? Or sentence them to a life without mother? What can we do to help the youngsters who have already been damaged by neglect or abuse. And what about the ordinary parent? Do we expose our children to psychological dangers when we ask others to care for them? We will be looking for answers when we ask, are mothers really